the next topic is sort of, well, it's basically about what do we think makes a good design team, like a successful design. Let's just focus on product design. I think we've all seen like hundreds of different product design teams in different companies at this point. We've seen successful ones who are consistently bringing good products to the market. We've seen maybe less successful ones who often end up getting trapped and going in circles and people leaving and getting rehired and all this kind of stuff. What do we think is like maybe the first question is, what does a successful product team look like? And how do you actually create one in a company? How do you create a company that has a, high chance of creating successful product teams? And go. Simple question.
Wow.
Simple question.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll start with a disclaimer, which is that I don't know much about managing or building product teams. I've sought in my career to avoid situations where I had to manage.
But you've
or hire
seen
The lone wolf.
Yeah, you've seen them. You've seen product teams or people working
Yeah.
together in a product team where you could say, okay, this team has something interesting.
Yeah, and I think that part of what's been common among teams that are performing really well is that if you have a tailwind of like, we have a successful business on our hands, we have product market fit, we're working on something that we're just starting out, but we're working on something we're all really excited about, that solves a lot of the problems that can crop up. It's just like on a sports team. Like you rarely see unhappy, like super successful sports teams like leading their league or winning the championship and just having like tons of internal strife. Like that doesn't really usually happen. If you're winning, you're happy. And if you're winning when you're building products, like that will solve a lot of problems. So it's important to remember that when you look at like, company A, like, has this culture, company B treats their employees like garbage, but everybody seems happy and like they still are working there and they're still attracting good people. Well, like if they're both successful, that can explain a lot of it, because it feels good to work on something that's successful, and that that just sort of makes things, it kind of fixes a lot of problems. I think that the real question is like, where is it fun to work, and if you're on the bubble, if you're like, especially if you're starting something new, whether it's a new venture at a big company or it's starting something from scratch, how do you create a culture that people want to be a part of, where you can attract sort of the best people, you can get people who will be able to help you deliver that vision? How do you create that when you don't already have momentum? And actually, I would turn the question around to you two, because you've gone in the last few years from like the two of you to having this really growing team that's really well respected, and people are clamoring to work there. I hear from people who are like, how can I get an internship or work at Aj&Smart? So what did you do to kind of go from the two of you to building momentum and having a sort of a positive culture?
Cloning.
Yeah.
I mean, it was
Samsung started cloning in the 80s.
I know. Samsung started before us. I think that at least for us, so essentially what we have within Aj&Smart is two product teams, like two relatively high quality product teams that are able to pump out very often successful products. But I wish the answer was that we had this formula and it was super easy. But the answer is actually, it's heavily reliant on the kind of people you hire. And I think that for us, it meant that we have grown very slowly over the last 6 years. We've hired people very slowly. We've hired people for roles that they didn't fit into and ended up fitting into something else very much more easy. And I think that just the flexibility that we have within the design teams for people to switch roles that they're more comfortable with, and also exposing people to every single part of the process, including the business side of the products. I think that's really, at least for us, when we figure out like this team is starting to work really well, it's usually a team that doesn't just understand, here's how you nail the UX and UI side of it, but also here's how we align the UX and UI and design and everything we do with the business needs of this company. So I think that one problem that I see within teams, within agencies or companies, is when the design team is considered a resource that can be tapped into to produce things, rather than having a seat at the table in terms of strategy for the overall product. And I think that successful teams, if you look at companies like Airbnb, which has a very successful design team, and it's very, people want to work there, and you hear a lot about it. They also produce a lot of really interesting tools for the design industry at large. they're very involved in product decisions that are usually coming from top down, where it's like, okay, we want to do this thing now. The design team is heavily involved in that, where the same thing is with Spotify, where the design team is not considered to be this resource like marketing or sales that the top down, the top management taps into, but they become part of the overall system. And I think that for us, I guess that it's a little bit easier to connect the design team with the business side of it, but it took us, I guess the way we
because
used to
design
do it
is your business.
Yeah, because design is our business, but actually at the first few years we did it the traditional and I would say wrong way, where myself and Michael as the founders used to go and visit the companies.
Yeah.
We used to listen to their business problems, we used to write it down, and then we used to come back to the office and pass that to the designers to produce the result. And this ended up in worse products. It ended up in way more misalignment. Overall, people being unsatisfied and just not as excited because they had no ownership of the sort of strategic decisions that we were talking about. Whereas now, every single, like each client gets its own product team from our side that they work with for 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks in the design sprint process. And even the person who's just involved in user testing or the person who's just going to be doing the prototype is sitting with the CEO of this company, with me, with someone else, and they're hearing directly from the source what is the strategy, what is the reason we're creating this thing. And I think that has definitely helped make the teams more... it's not just about production anymore. They feel like they have some ownership over the direction of the company of the direction of the product that they're working on. And I think that in companies I've worked at before starting AJ&Smart, where the decisions would kind of come out of nowhere and like the briefs would appear from thin air, or someone would come down from the tower and say, here's what we have to do, but with zero context. You generally had this like discontent within the teams. Because people we didn't know why we were creating this product. We didn't know what we were supposed to do. We just knew we had to make something that somehow is like Skype, but with a Tinder-like interface. But we didn't really get, you didn't have the context of where that came from. And the person you would ask, maybe the creative director, they may not be able to explain to you the way their superior explained to them what they want. You'd be working on something for 6 months and then you finally present it back to the superior and they just say, no, that's not what I was talking about. And I think this starts to break down the design teams and kind of kill the motivation and the momentum. And you hear that a lot from even some of the big companies here in Silicon Valley, where you're talking to a design team and they're saying, sometimes it's really nice working there, but I've had the last year, there's been so many changes from the top, which we don't really understand, that stuff is just getting scrapped the whole time. And what happens is those people then start to leave, and then you start to, the team starts, you have a high turnover, which results in a team that's not really well oiled.
Yeah, that can work. That kind of compartmentalized approach can work for a while if you happen to have product market fit. If you're working on something that turns out people want, which a big portion of that is luck. You come across the right idea and you're executing it at the right time and whatever, but it's not for the long term going to be sustainable, and it's going to be, you will over time lose people if your culture is top down, because it's not as fun, and many places are adapting their culture to find ways for everybody to contribute, to feel like they have ownership over something, and feeling like you have ownership over what you do, that's a big deal, right? That's fun.
Yeah, I wonder if it's about, ownership is great, but I also think you need, and people in teams need this almost recognition for their work, right? Or for the effort that they're putting in. And I don't mean like recognition internally, although that's a big point, right? Internally, that your work gets seen. I think that, and this is something that the sprint process really enables for teams, is that your work gets put in front of your end customer in whatever state it is, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to wait till it's released, because, except for these huge companies or companies that really, are in the business of getting stuff out in the market, which is just a hard thing to do. Product and design teams then just don't get this kind of feedback from their customers that what they're doing is any good.
Yeah.
So when you work and when you start to work in like it's a sprint process, for instance, and you're actually like forced to put your work in front of the customers all the time, I think that this is where designers and, let's say, creative problem solvers get a lot of energy and a lot of kind of, okay, we didn't get it quite right now, but we've reduced this kind of like fear of being wrong. So we know that we can have another crack at it next week, for instance, you know, if you're working in a sprint methodology, or you've got a sprint coming up where you could just have a crack at maybe just tackling that problem a little bit differently than you've done it before. And you're not going to get this kind of, okay, released it, nothing really worked, you're all fired, next team comes in, right? I mean, if you just build in that culture where it's, and I mean, this is something where you can, I mean, we were talking about Apple and Google and things like that, right? Then we have like the Google Wallet, and we have so many projects, right? And they're just testing all these things out. I don't know if those teams like got fired or they got moved on. Like they're all amazing designers, right? I imagine. So I think you have to, as well as hiring great people, then you have to like make sure that you're working in a way that gives your designers this constant feedback. You can't give that internally because it's not really worth as much as putting it in front of the customer and having this real feedback on the work you've done.